And what's happening in Sweden right now could be the financial disaster that reshapes Europe forever. While the world celebrated Scandinavian socialism as the perfect system, cracks have been forming beneath the surface for years, and now the entire foundation is crumbling. Drop a comment below with your country's name if you think your nation could be next, and smash that subscribe button because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about economic stability. Sweden's welfare state, once praised as humanity's greatest achievement in balancing capitalism with social justice, is experiencing a terminal crisis that economists have been warning about for decades, but politicians refuse to acknowledge. The famous Swedish model, built on high taxes, generous benefits, and universal public services, functioned beautifully when the population was homogeneous, employment rates were sky-high, and demographic trends favored a large working-age population supporting fewer retirees. That delicate balance has shattered completely. Recent data from Statistics Sweden shows that government debt is rising at unprecedented rates, while tax revenues fail to keep pace with exploding welfare costs. The migration crisis that began in 2015 brought over 400,000 asylum seekers into a country of just 10 million people, fundamentally altering the economic equation. Integration into the labor market has proven far more difficult than predicted, with employment rates among foreign-born residents sitting at nearly 20 percentage points below native Swedes, according to 2024 figures. The welfare system that once seemed invincible now faces impossible mathematics. For every person receiving benefits, there must be enough workers paying taxes to fund those benefits, but Sweden's dependency ratio has shifted dramatically. Healthcare costs are spiraling out of control as the population ages, with projections showing that by 2030, nearly 1 in 4 Swedes will be over 65 years old. The pension system, designed when life expectancy was much lower, now pays benefits for decades longer than originally planned. Sweden's famous public healthcare system, once the envy of the world, is collapsing under its own weight. Wait times for surgeries have exploded to dangerous levels, with patients waiting over a year for hip replacements and cancer treatments delayed beyond safe medical windows. Emergency rooms overflow with patients sleeping in hallways, and healthcare workers are fleeing the profession due to impossible workloads and deteriorating conditions. The government has tried throwing money at the problem, but the fundamental issue is structural, not financial. Private healthcare clinics are emerging across Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö, serving those wealthy enough to pay out of pocket while the middle class suffers through the failing public system. This creates a two-tier society that directly contradicts the egalitarian principles Sweden built its identity upon. The social contract is breaking down as people begin questioning why they pay the world's highest taxes for services that no longer function properly. Crime rates have surged to levels unimaginable just 15 years ago. Sweden now has the highest per capita rate of fatal shootings in Europe, with gang violence concentrated in immigrant-heavy suburbs turning parts of major cities into no-go zones where police hesitate to enter. Explosions from grenade attacks and bombings occur with shocking regularity, something completely alien to Swedish society before 2010. The justice system struggles to cope with this new reality, and prisons are overcrowded beyond capacity. The economic consequences extend far beyond direct costs of policing and incarceration. Businesses are relocating from affected areas, property values have collapsed in certain neighborhoods, and insurance premiums have skyrocketed. Middle-class families who can afford to are fleeing these areas, creating further economic segregation and concentrating poverty. The tax base in affected municipalities is eroding precisely when they need more resources to address social problems. Sweden's legendary education system, which once produced world-leading literacy and numeracy rates, has fallen dramatically in international rankings. PISA scores have declined consistently over the past 2 decades, with Swedish 15-year-olds now performing below the OECD average in mathematics. The introduction of free school choice and privatization of education created a market where profit-driven companies run schools with minimal oversight, often cutting corners on quality to maximize returns for shareholders. Teacher shortages are reaching crisis levels as the profession becomes less attractive due to low pay relative to the cost of living, challenging working conditions, and lack of support from administrators. Schools in disadvantaged areas struggle to recruit qualified teachers at all, creating an educational gap that ensures the next generation will be less equipped to compete in the global economy. This is economic suicide in slow motion for a nation that has always relied on human capital as its primary resource. The manufacturing sector that once formed the backbone of Sweden's economy is shrinking rapidly. Companies like Volvo, Ericsson, and IKEA still exist, but have moved much of their production abroad, where labor costs are lower and regulations less stringent. The high tax burden on businesses makes Sweden increasingly uncompetitive compared to other European nations that have reduced corporate taxes to attract investment. Startups and innovative companies that could replace traditional industries are choosing to establish themselves in other Nordic countries or leaving Scandinavia entirely. Energy costs have become a critical competitive disadvantage following Sweden's aggressive green transition policies. While environmental goals are admirable, the rapid phase-out of nuclear power before renewable alternatives were fully ready created an energy shortage that drives up prices for both businesses and consumers. Industries that require large amounts of electricity are particularly hard hit, and some have announced plant closures or relocations to countries with more stable and affordable energy supplies. The housing market presents another dimension of Sweden's economic crisis. Decades of rent control and restrictive building regulations created a severe shortage of affordable housing in major cities, with waiting lists for rental apartments stretching beyond 10 years in Stockholm. Young people cannot find places to live, which delays family formation, reduces labor mobility, and creates a generation stuck in precarious housing situations. The black market for rental contracts thrives, with illegal sublets commanding enormous premiums. Construction costs have risen to absurd levels due to building codes that require extremely high environmental standards, making it economically unviable to build affordable housing. The projects that do get built are luxury apartments aimed at wealthy buyers, doing nothing to address the shortage for ordinary Swedes. This housing crisis contributes to social tensions and makes it difficult for companies to recruit talent who cannot find anywhere to live. Sweden's banking sector faces exposure to a potential real estate crash that could trigger financial contagion throughout the Nordic region. Swedish households carry some of the highest debt-to-income ratios in the developed world, with mortgage debt approaching 180% of disposable income. Most of these mortgages are variable rate loans, meaning borrowers are extremely vulnerable to interest rate increases. As the central bank has been forced to raise rates to combat inflation, thousands of families face payment increases they cannot afford. A wave of mortgage defaults could devastate banks that have been lending aggressively during years of low interest rates. The interconnected nature of Nordic financial systems means that a crisis in Sweden would quickly spread to Denmark, Norway, and Finland. European banking authorities are watching nervously, aware that Sweden's banking sector is large enough to pose systemic risks if major institutions fail. The political system seems paralyzed and unable to address these mounting crises. Swedish politics has fragmented into multiple parties with incompatible visions for the country's future. The traditional consensus-based approach that characterized Swedish governance for decades has broken down completely. Coalition governments struggle to implement meaningful reforms because any proposal that touches the welfare state provokes fierce resistance from entrenched interests. Right-wing parties advocate for dramatic cuts to immigration and welfare spending, while left-wing parties insist that the solution is even higher taxes and more government intervention. The moderate center that once dominated Swedish politics has collapsed, leaving a polarized landscape where compromise becomes impossible. Meanwhile, the problems grow worse with each passing year that decisive action is delayed. Young Swedes are increasingly pessimistic about their futures in ways that would have been unthinkable for previous generations. Surveys show declining confidence that they will achieve the same standard of living their parents enjoyed, let alone surpass it. Brain drain is accelerating as educated young professionals seek opportunities abroad, particularly in Switzerland, the United States, and other Nordic countries with better prospects. Sweden is losing exactly the people it needs most to turn the situation around. The social trust that made Sweden's high-tax model possible is eroding rapidly. When citizens believe their taxes fund services that benefit everyone fairly, they willingly pay high rates. But when they see waste, dysfunction, and benefits flowing to people who haven't contributed to the system, that willingness disappears. Tax compliance is declining, the informal economy is growing, and more people seek ways to minimize their tax burden. This creates a vicious cycle where falling revenues force service cuts, which further reduces trust and compliance. Sweden's experience serves as a warning about the limits of welfare state models in a globalized world with free movement of people. The system was designed for a specific set of demographic and economic conditions that no longer exist and may never return. Attempts to preserve it through ever higher taxes and borrowing are only delaying the inevitable reckoning while making the eventual adjustment more painful. The economic death spiral is already in motion. Lower tax revenues combined with higher spending on welfare, healthcare, and public safety create growing deficits. Government borrowing increases, leading to higher debt service costs that consume more of the budget. Rating agencies have already begun downgrading Swedish debt, increasing borrowing costs further. At some point, international lenders will demand serious reforms in exchange for continued financing, forcing austerity measures that will be deeply unpopular. What happens in Sweden matters far beyond its borders. The Nordic model has been held up as proof that high-tax welfare states can deliver both prosperity and equality. If Sweden collapses economically, it undermines the ideological foundation that many European social democrats rely upon. It also raises uncomfortable questions about migration, integration, and cultural compatibility that most Western European politicians prefer to avoid. The financial markets are beginning to price in serious risk of Swedish economic crisis. The krona has weakened significantly against other major currencies, making imports more expensive and putting upward pressure on inflation. Foreign investors are reducing their exposure to Swedish assets, particularly real estate and banking sector securities. If this becomes a full-scale flight of capital, Sweden could face a currency crisis on top of everything else. Some economists argue that Sweden still has options to avoid complete disaster. Dramatic reforms to the pension system, means testing of benefits, significant reductions in immigration levels, and major investments in integration programs could potentially stabilize the situation. However, implementing such reforms requires political courage that seems entirely absent from current Swedish leadership. Every year that passes without action makes the required adjustments more severe. The irony is that Sweden's crisis stems partly from the success of its own model. The generous welfare state attracted immigration from people seeking those benefits, but the system cannot support unlimited numbers of recipients. The high living standards made Swedes complacent and unwilling to acknowledge problems until they became severe. The consensus-based political culture that served the country well during decades of prosperity proves inadequate for making hard choices during crisis. Future historians will likely point to Sweden as a case study in how even the most successful economic models can fail when underlying conditions change. The Swedish social model didn't die because it was poorly designed, but because the assumptions it was built upon no longer hold true. In a world of aging populations, mass migration, and global economic competition,
The arithmetic of high-tax welfare states simply doesn't work anymore unless paired with strict controls on who can access benefits. The coming economic crisis in Sweden will be painful and prolonged. There is no quick fix or easy solution to problems that have accumulated over decades. The next generation of Swedes will face a significantly lower standard of living than their parents, and the social cohesion that characterized Swedish society will likely never fully recover. Other nations watching this unfold should take note and consider whether their own welfare systems are built on sustainable foundations or are similarly headed for collapse. Retry.